"Don't go near the dog," the man said. He didn't ask. He didn't warn. He announced it the way people announce something they've already decided is fact, flat, certain, with just enough edge to make sure you understood the consequences of not listening. Vera Mullen heard him from across the waiting room. She had been kneeling beside the intake counter, picking up a folder that had slipped off the edge when the front door swung open hard enough to knock the wreath off the hook above it. Door first, then the dog, then himself, in that order, as though he was accustomed to clearing a path before occupying it. The dog was a German shepherd, enormous and silver gray along the muzzle, moving with a stiffness in his right rear leg that Vera noticed before she noticed anything else about either of them. The man was in civilian clothes, but wore them the way some men wear a uniform even when they're not. Straight back, deliberate steps, eyes already cataloging the room before he'd finished walking into it. His jaw was set. His hand on the leash was not tight, exactly, but it was controlled. The kind of hold that says, "I am the reason this animal is still manageable." The dog's name, she would learn later, was Ajax. Vera was 31 years old and had been a veterinary technician at Covington Animal Hospital for going on 4 years. She was not easily rattled by large dogs or the men who sometimes came with them. She had grown up in rural Kentucky with 3 siblings and a father who bred working dogs, and she understood the language of animals in the specific way that people do when they have spent more time with them than without. She straightened up with the folder in her hand and looked at the man. He had already looked away from her. "Ajax," he said, pulling the leash slightly to the left. The dog obeyed but kept his nose angled toward Vera. "Sit." Ajax sat. His right leg trembled. "Sir," said Denise from behind the counter. She was the office manager, 40-something, unfailingly cheerful in a way that had nothing performative about it. "We have you down for 2 o'clock with Dr. Fenn. It's just going to be a few minutes. How long? Maybe 10. We had a complicated. Fine." He took a seat along the far wall, Ajax beside him, and he did not look at anyone else in the room. There was a woman with a tabby cat in a carrier, 2 kids with a rabbit in a cardboard box, and an older man with a basset hound asleep across his lap. None of them looked at the shepherd's handler for very long. Something about the way he sat discouraged it. Vera went back to the treatment corridor to finish prepping the room for Ajax's intake. She had read the file. The dog had been a working military K9, bomb detection, 3 deployments, currently honorably retired, and in the care of the man listed as his handler, Staff Sergeant David Costa. She had read that name and looked at the medical history and understood that the dog had been through more in his 8 years of life than most animals ever were. The limp was documented. Shrapnel injury to the right hip. 2 surgeries, ongoing mobility issues. The behavioral notes were shorter but clear. Elevated stress response in clinical environments. Handler presence required at all times. Do not approach without authorization. She had noted this. She had not been alarmed by it. She had in fact spent 20 minutes before the appointment reading about hip dysplasia management in older working dogs, because that was the kind of person she was. What she had not anticipated was Costa himself. When he came through the corridor with Ajax, Dr. Fenn met them at the door of exam room 2. Fenn was their senior vet, mid-50s, gray-bearded, the kind of calm that comes from decades of practice. He extended his hand to Costa, and Costa shook it once, quick, businesslike. "Staff Sergeant, good to meet you. I've reviewed Ajax's history, then you know how this works." "I know he prefers his space," Fenn said easily. "We'll keep things slow." Vera was already in the room, standing near the far cabinet, clipboard in hand. She had positioned herself deliberately, low threat, peripheral, giving the dog room to orient without feeling cornered. She'd done this thousands of times. It was second nature. Costa came in and his eyes went to her immediately. "Who's this?" It wasn't a question, not really. It was an assessment. "Vera Mullen, our senior vet tech," Fenn said. "She'll be assisting today." Costa looked at her for a moment. Something passed across his face, not quite dismissal, but close. The look of a man recalibrating, deciding she was not worth addressing directly. He doesn't do well with strangers, especially women. Vera kept her expression true to Churchill. "Understood. I mean that literally. He's bitten. I know." I read his file. There was a pause. Costa glanced at Fenn as if to confirm this was acceptable, and Fenn gave a small nod. Costa exhaled through his nose. "Fine. But you stay on that side of the room. You don't touch him. You don't approach him. You don't make any sudden movements. If I tell you to leave, you leave." Of course, Vera said. She didn't argue. She didn't explain herself. She turned back to the clipboard and began writing the date on the intake form, and she did not look at him again for a while. Ajax was led to the exam table, or rather he was guided, carefully, because getting up onto the surface clearly cost him something, and even with Costa's hand steady on his flanks, the dog made a low sound, not a growl, but a sound of effort and discomfort that was somehow harder to hear. He made it once and went quiet. Dr. Fenn began the examination. Costa stood at Ajax's head, one hand resting on the dog's neck, not gripping but grounding. Vera took notes, called out vitals when asked, handed Fenn instruments without being told to. She had worked with him long enough that their movements were almost choreographed. She was quiet. She had decided, without making a production of the decision, that quiet was what Ajax needed right now. But she watched him. She watched the way he breathed, a little fast, a little shallow, the way animals breathe when they are managing fear rather than feeling none. She watched the way his eyes moved around the room, fixing on objects, on people, tracking. She watched his ears, which went back when Fenn pressed on his right hip and stayed back, and she filed all of it away. She also watched Costa. He was, she could see now, genuinely devoted to this dog. Whatever edge he had brought into the room, whatever bristle and command presence, fell away slightly when he was talking to Ajax. His voice dropped. He used the dog's name often, quietly, like a reassurance that had become habit. Easy, Ajax. Easy. I've got you. Good boy. Good boy. This was not a man who didn't care. This was a man who cared too much and had decided the only way to protect that was to control everything around it. She understood this. She didn't say so. At some point, she would remember it as about halfway through the examination. Dr. Fenn found something that made him pause. He pressed gently along the lower lumbar area, and Ajax stiffened, and Costa's hand tightened on the dog's neck, and Fenn said carefully, "There's some new inflammation here. It's possible the condition has progressed since the last X-ray." Costa's jaw was already tight. What does that mean? It means I'd like to get updated imaging before I say anything definitive. Let me have Kim pull the radiograph room. He stepped back from the table and looked at Vera. Can you stay with Ajax while I step out? She said yes. Costa said, I'll come with you. He followed Fenn out of the room, but he paused in the doorway and looked back at Vera. The look was clear. Don't touch him. She nodded. The door didn't quite close behind them. She stayed where she was for a moment. Ajax was on the table, and his breathing had quickened, and she watched him scan the room for Costa and not find him, and the low sound came back. Not aggression, not this time. She recognized it for what it was. She had heard it before, in animals, and once or twice in people. It was the sound of not knowing if you're safe. She didn't move toward him. She didn't make any sudden shift. She simply turned slightly, still at the far cabinet, and spoke quietly into the room as if she were talking to no one in particular. You're okay, she said. He's just down the hall. He's coming back. Ajax's ears moved. One forward, he found her with his eyes. You've been doing this a long time, she said. Still quiet, still not moving. All those places, all those years, you know how to hold on. This is just a room. You can handle a room. It was not a command. It was not instruction. It was just a voice, low, even unhurried. Ajax's breathing slowed, not dramatically, just perceptibly. And then something happened that Vera would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately, because it happened the way things sometimes do, without a clear beginning, so gradually that by the time you registered it, it had already been true for a while. Ajax looked at her. Not the scanning look of a dog taking stock of a threat, not the flat, wall-eyed look of an animal in shutdown. He looked at her the way dogs look at people they have decided, for reasons entirely their own, to extend some measure of trust. He lifted his head slightly. He made a low sound that was different from the others. Vera stayed still for another 10 seconds. Then she moved, slowly, intentionally, no sudden angles, one step toward the table. Then another. She held her hand out, loose, palm slightly down, not reaching for him but making herself available. Ajax leaned forward and pressed his nose against her fingers. That was when Costa came back into the room. She heard him before she saw him. The pause in his step when he registered what he was looking at. She turned and found him standing in the doorway, and Dr. Fenn just behind him with his tablet, and Costa's face was doing something complicated. He had walked back into a room, expecting to find things exactly as he left them, and instead found his dog, who had bitten a veterinary assistant in Bethesda, who could not be handled by anyone outside of active duty without incident, who had required special documentation in 3 different states, leaning his enormous silver head against the hand of a woman he had known for 25 minutes. "What?" Costa said quietly. "Are you doing?" Vera looked at him. He was stressed. "I was talking to him. I told you not to touch him." "I know," he asked. There was a silence that had a kind of weight to it, and then Costa looked at Ajax, and Ajax, who was still leaning against Vera's hand, not anxiously but with a kind of settled, deliberate pressure, did not look back at him. And that, more than anything else, seemed to stop Costa cold. He came into the room slowly and stopped a few feet from the table and looked at his dog, who was leaning quietly against the hand of a woman who'd read his file and decided what he needed before she ever laid eyes on him, and something shifted in Costa's face. It was subtle, the way most real things are. The jaw didn't change, but the eyes did. He looked at Vera. "He doesn't do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I've had trainers couldn't get within 2 feet of him in a clinical setting. He knew I wasn't going to push him. How?" It was a real question. She could hear it. Not challenge, bewilderment. The question of a man who has been operating from a very specific set of beliefs about what his dog is capable of and has just watched the ground shift beneath them. Vera thought about how to answer. She kept her hand where it was. Ajax was very still. "Animals know when you're managing them versus being with them," she said. "He's been managed a lot. He's good at it. But I think he was tired today." Costa looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ajax again. He reached out, slowly, and put his hand on the dog's back, and Ajax leaned into both of them. Costa on one side, Vera on the other, and the room got quieter than rooms usually get. "He's been having trouble sleeping," Costa said. He said it to the dog, technically, but he said it at a volume meant for someone else. "I didn't put that in the paperwork because it seemed—" He stopped. "I didn't know how to write it." "How long?" Vera asked. "Few months." A pause. "Since his last partner retired. The dog he trained with, they reassigned them separately, and another pause. Longer this time. He changed." Vera looked at Ajax. "Like grief," she said. Costa didn't answer right away. When he did, he said, "Yeah." And then after a beat, "Like grief." Dr. Fenn, who had been very quietly reviewing something on his tablet near the door, looked up. "We can talk about some options there. There's been some recent work on separation-related stress in retired working dogs. Behavioral and pharmacological both. It might be worth exploring alongside the physical management." Costa nodded, once, slowly. He had the look of a man who had come in expecting to fight for something and discovered he didn't have to. "Okay," he said. The imaging took another 20 minutes. Vera helped position Ajax on the radiograph table, and this time Costa watched her instead of hovering, and Ajax was still while she held him, her hand resting on his side, talking quietly about nothing. The weather turning cooler, a dog she'd known as a kid named Buster who ate an entire wheel of cheese and survived fine, the way light looked different in October than any other month. Ajax listened, or he seemed to. His breathing was slow. When Fenn reviewed the images, the news was not easy. The degeneration had advanced, and they'd be talking about managed decline rather than reversal. Pain management, hydrotherapy, careful exercise, quality of life being the frame for every decision from here. Fenn laid it out with the quiet directness Vera had always respected him for, and Costa sat in the chair across from him and took it in, and when Fenn said he's not in pain right now, but will need to stay ahead of it, Costa nodded and said, "What do I do? Not what can be done. What do I do?" Fenn walked him through it, and Vera took notes for both of them, the specific kind of notes that translate clinical language into daily life. This is what the medication schedule looks like. This is what a bad day might look like. This is when you call us. Afterward, when Fenn had gone and the forms were being finished at the counter, Costa stood with Ajax in the front waiting room, and Vera came out with a folder of printed materials and a small bag of the joint supplement samples Fenn had approved. She handed them over. He took them, looked at the folder for a moment, then looked at her. "You've done this a long time," he said. It was different from what she'd said to Ajax. It wasn't a question. 4 years here, she said. Grew up with working dogs. He nodded slowly. I could tell, not everyone can. She didn't say anything to that. He looked down at Ajax, who was sitting beside him and watching Vera with calm, steady attention. He hasn't done that in. Costa started. He stopped, reconsidered. I brought him to a clinic in Virginia last spring. He had to be sedated before they could get near him. Cost me 3 days of him just trying to come back to himself afterward. Vera looked at Ajax. That's not going to help him. No, Costa said. I know that now. He was quiet for a moment. Ajax turned and leaned against his handler's leg, and Costa put his hand on the dog's head without looking, the way people touch something they've learned to love without having to think about it anymore. I was trying to protect him, Costa said. The keep-away thing. The warnings. I know, Vera said. I didn't. He stopped again. There was something in the way he kept stopping that told her this was not a man who stopped often. I wasn't sure anyone else was going to take it seriously. How much he'd been through. I read his file, Vera said. I take all of them seriously, but I could see him. She paused. He's a remarkable dog. Costa looked at her then, straight, unguarded in a way he hadn't been when he walked in. Yeah, he said. He is. Denise, behind the counter, was making the follow-up appointment on the computer, and she was doing it with great focus and a particular stillness that meant she was absolutely listening. Vera was aware of this and didn't mind. We'll schedule the hydrotherapy consult for next week if you're available, Vera said. I can send you the handouts Fen mentioned if you have an email. Costa gave her his email. She wrote it on the back of the folder. He looked at her handwriting. She had big, clear letters, the kind you get from writing thousands of notes in low light, and said, That's a lot of information to learn about a dog in one afternoon. It's what I do, she said. He nodded. He picked up the bag and the folder, and he looked like he was going to say something else, but then he looked at Ajax, who was still watching Vera, and whatever he'd been about to say changed shape. Thank you, he said. And the way he said it was not perfunctory. It had the particular quality of words that Geffert to choose. That's what we're here for, Vera said. Ajax stood up when Costa moved toward the door, fell in beside him with that careful, deliberate gait, and at the threshold he paused. The dog paused, on his own, and looked back at Vera. She raised her hand, just slightly. He held her eyes for a moment with those pale, serious eyes that had seen things she would never be able to imagine, and then he turned and went through the door and down the steps, matching his stride carefully to Costa's, who had slowed without appearing to notice that he'd done it. The door swung closed. Denise waited exactly 3 seconds. Okay, she said. That was something. Vera set the clipboard down on the counter. Outside, through the glass door, she could just see Costa opening the rear door of a truck and Ajax stepping up slowly, and Costa's hand on the dog's back steadying him. He was just scared, she said. The dog? Vera thought about it for a moment. Both of them, she said. She picked up the next file from the stack and went back down the corridor, and the afternoon continued the way afternoons do. Another patient, another chart, another life carried in through the front door and trusted temporarily into her hands. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. She just didn't make a point of announcing it.